Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question you probably don't ask yourself very often. What was it actually like to be a regular soldier stuck in Napoleon's army in the middle of some freezing, never-ending winter campaign? Spoiler alert, it wasn't glamorous. There were no cozy fireside chats with Napoleon himself, no fancy French wine tastings, and definitely no fluffy white hotel duvets waiting after a long march. Unless by duvet you mean a lice-infested blanket that smelled vaguely like wet horse, which, honestly, most of the time you did. So, dim the lights, settle in, get comfortable, because tonight we're not following the flashy generals in their gold braid uniforms. No, we're going down into the mud, the frost, and the frozen soup kettles of Napoleon's ordinary foot soldiers. And yes, they had to somehow survive this while still fighting wars that the emperor thought were brilliant ideas. Now, Napoleon had one big problem. He loved war. Not just a little hobby war now and then, but the constant, full-time, subscription-based kind of war. He dragged his soldiers from Italy to Austria to Spain, and of course to Russia. And unfortunately for them, climate control hadn't been invented yet. So when winter rolled in, they had to rely on, well, whatever bits of survival instinct they had left. Let's start with clothing. You'd think the French army might provide nice warm coats, maybe even something chic, because after all, this is France. But no. Ordinary infantrymen were usually stuck with a thin wool uniform that was fine for parading in Paris, but less fine when you were knee-deep in Polish snowdrifts. Some soldiers did get greatcoats, but distribution was unreliable, which meant many ended up wrapping themselves in whatever they could steal or improvise. Old blankets, women's shawls, the occasional carpet ripped from a farmhouse. Basically, if it draped, it worked. Of course, footwear was another story. The French army's shoes were, let's call them minimalist. Thin leather soles, nailed together with about as much durability as wet cardboard. Marching hundreds of miles in those meant frostbite was practically a daily event. Soldiers stuffed straw inside to keep their toes from freezing solid. Did it work? Sort of. If by work you mean your feet didn't fall off immediately. Now let's drift over to the subject of food, because no winter misery story is complete with a tragic menu. The French army ration system was optimistic. Each soldier was theoretically entitled to bread, meat, wine, and salt, which sounds amazing, right? Almost like a picnic. But the reality was different. In winter, supply wagons got stuck in the snow. Horses died. Roads vanished under ice. And by the time rations reached the soldiers, if they reached them at all, it was usually hard biscuits and a few scraps of questionable meat. When things got truly desperate, soldiers ate whatever they could find. Horse meat became pretty standard. They even boiled horse bones into soup, which was less delicious broth and more gray water with chunks. There are plenty of accounts of soldiers chewing bark, eating leather straps, or gnawing at the occasional dead animal they found frozen on the roadside. Gourmet dining, it was not. And then there's the issue of warmth. Fires were tricky. You wanted one desperately, but lighting a fire meant gathering wood in the freezing cold, which took time and exposed you to enemy scouts. Also, sometimes there just wasn't any wood. Snow-covered plains are surprisingly short on Home Depot supplies. When they could get a fire going, soldiers huddled together, trying to warm their stiff fingers over the flames. But even then, the smoke was choking. The sparks burned holes in their already pitiful clothes, and the fires had to be small so they didn't attract attention. So, what else kept them warm? Well, each other. Literally. Soldiers often slept in groups pressed together in the dirt, wrapped under shared blankets, and probably not trying to think too hard about the smell. In some cases, they even dug shallow pits, crawled inside, and covered themselves with branches or snow for insulation. Yes, you heard that right. They used snow as a blanket.
Hygiene, of course, was a lost cause. Bathing in the middle of a Napoleonic winter campaign was not happening. Water was frozen solid anyway, so soldiers went weeks, sometimes months, without washing. Lice and fleas were constant companions. One soldier wrote that you could actually hear the lice crackling in the seams of your clothes when you sat near a fire, which is a mental image nobody really asked for, but here we are. Now, let's talk about morale. Because surviving physically was only half the battle. Surviving mentally was a whole other challenge. Imagine trudging for hours every day, cold, hungry, exhausted, your feet bleeding inside rotten shoes, while officers screamed at you to keep moving. Then imagine knowing you'd have to do the same thing tomorrow, and the day after that. Not exactly the motivational poster material. Some soldiers coped with dark humor. Others drank whatever alcohol they could scavenge, vodka in Russia, cheap brandy elsewhere. Of course, drinking in freezing temperatures had its own dangers, since alcohol made you feel warm while actually lowering your core temperature. But when you're freezing and miserable, that extra sip of vodka seemed like a decent trade. Desertion was another coping mechanism. Soldiers slipped away when they could, hiding in forests or trying to blend in with local peasants. But winter wasn't exactly the best time to wander around Europe with no food or shelter, so many deserters froze just as badly as their comrades. Let's float gently into one of the worst examples, the Russian campaign of 1812. Napoleon had the bright idea to march into Russia with around 600,000 men. That's a lot of boots on the ground, or at least a lot of thin leather slippers on the ground. The plan went about as well as you'd expect. They marched in during summer, but by the time winter came, everything turned into a disaster zone. Temperatures dropped to -20, -30 degrees Celsius. Supply wagons broke down, horses died en masse, and the soldiers, well, let's just say their survival strategies became increasingly desperate. One French officer recalled men cutting strips of meat from their dead horses, then tucking the frozen chunks inside their coats to thaw slowly against their bodies. It was like wearing a meat scarf. Not exactly chic Parisian fashion, but when you're starving, you improvise. Another survival technique was something we might politely call recycling. Soldiers burned whatever they could find: wood, wagons, even furniture ripped from peasant houses. If you could break it apart and set it on fire, it became fuel. There are even reports of soldiers pulling apart entire wooden churches just to feed their campfires, which probably didn't endear them to the local population, but again, warmth first, diplomacy later. Of course, not everyone survived. Far from it. Out of that massive 600,000-man army that marched into Russia, maybe 100,000 staggered back out. And many of those survivors carried frostbite scars, missing fingers, missing toes, and memories they probably never wanted to talk about again. Now, if this is all sounding terribly bleak, don't worry. We'll sprinkle in a few lighter details. Because soldiers weren't only miserable, they also invented little tricks and rituals to keep themselves sane. For example, many carried small keepsakes from home, lockets, letters, lucky charms, that gave them something to focus on besides the snow. Some groups of soldiers sang songs around the fire at night, partly to boost morale, and partly because singing made you forget your teeth were chattering. And believe it or not, gambling was huge. Soldiers played cards, dice, or whatever improvised games that could come up with. Sometimes the stakes were small: extra food, a drink of brandy. Other times it got more dramatic. There are accounts of soldiers gambling away their coats, boots, or even their weapons. Which sounds absurd, but if you're half frozen and half mad with boredom, maybe you decide, sure, I'll bet my shoes on this dice roll, then immediately regret it. Friendship was another survival tool. bonds formed between soldiers who shared the worst conditions together. They became little families, looking out for each other, sharing scraps of food, trading clothes, and dragging one another along when exhaustion set in. Because in a winter like that, if you collapsed in the snow, odds were you weren't getting up again. And through all this, Napoleon himself? Well, he was usually riding in relative comfort, surrounded by his personal guard, with better supplies and better horses. He occasionally tried to boost morale by making appearances, but let's just say the average soldier wasn't overly comforted by the sight of the emperor in his fancy cloak, looking irritated that his gloves were slightly chilly. So to sum it up so far, ordinary soldiers in Napoleon's army survived winter through a mix of terrible footwear, improvised clothing, questionable cuisine, small fires, lice infestations, dark humor, and the occasional stolen bottle of alcohol. And of course, sheer stubbornness. Because sometimes sheer stubbornness is all you've got. Let's drift a little further, though, because surviving winter wasn't just about physical suffering. It was also about the small, weird details that give us a window into their lives. And that's where we'll float next.
So, when we left off, we had French soldiers half frozen in their thin wool coats, playing dice with each other's boots, and probably humming sad songs about bread, which, honestly, was the soundtrack of half of Europe during Napoleon's wars. But let's sink a little deeper into daily life, because it wasn't just about the big, dramatic, freezing to death in Russia moments. No, the ordinary soldier had to survive a whole lot of mundane misery first. Let's start with marching. Napoleon's men were basically professional walkers, long-distance athletes, except instead of medals at the finish line, they usually got another mud-filled campsite. Soldiers sometimes marched 20 miles a day, even in snow and sleet. Imagine doing that in shoes that barely kept the pebbles out, let alone the slush. By the end of the day, their feet were swollen, raw, and blistered. Socks were rare, so they wrapped their feet in rags, straw, or even bits of cloth torn from old uniforms. A lot of soldiers ended up limping along with bleeding toes, frostbite nipping at their heels. And of course, Napoleon didn't exactly schedule snow days. If the emperor wanted you to march, you marched. Snowstorms, icy rivers, wind that cut through bone, it didn't matter. The order was to keep moving, because standing still, in his eyes, was worse than freezing. And to be fair, standing still probably did mean freezing. So the soldiers shuffled onward, half like men, half like exhausted penguins, dragging their muskets through the drifts. Now, when they did stop for the night, the fun really began. Campsites were, let's call them, minimalist retreats. Soldiers were expected to set up camp quickly, which in winter meant scraping snow away with bare hands or bayonets, then trying to build a little shelter out of branches, mud, or whatever wreckage they could scavenge. Tents? Theoretically, the army had tents, but in practice there were never enough, and the ones they had were old, torn, and about as windproof as a fishing net. So most soldiers just made do. Some dug shallow pits in the ground and laid branches over the top, creating makeshift burrows. Others stacked snow into little walls to block the wind, then huddled behind them. A few got creative, mixing straw and mud into crude huts, though these usually collapsed in the night or caught fire when someone tried to cook inside. The luxury version of accommodation was cramming into a peasant's barn or abandoned house, but barns filled up fast and houses were often already stripped bare by earlier waves of soldiers, so back to the snow pits. Speaking of barns, this brings us to one of the soldiers' favorite survival strategies: scavenging, or to put it bluntly, looting. If there was a village nearby, soldiers would spread out like hungry ants, tearing through houses looking for food, blankets, or anything vaguely useful. Chickens disappeared. Bread ovens were emptied. Furniture was burned for firewood. Curtains became cloaks. Even wallpaper sometimes got peeled off the walls, either to use as insulation or, believe it or not, rolled into makeshift cigarettes. Yes, soldiers really did smoke wallpaper. Desperate times, desperate lungs.
Not that local peasants were thrilled about this. Many villagers hid their food or fled altogether when they saw French troops approaching. But desperate soldiers got creative. They poked bayonets into haystacks looking for hidden grain. They sniffed around cellars. Some even dug into frozen ground, hoping to uncover buried potatoes. You might say Napoleonic soldiers were the original extreme scavenger hunters, only with less TV coverage and much worse prizes. Now, let's drift over to health, because it's not enough to be cold and hungry, you also had to be sick. The winter campaigns were basically mobile disease festivals. Typhus, dysentery, scurvy, frostbite, you name it, they had it. And since medicine at the time was mostly bleed the patient or give him wine, let's just say recovery rates weren't stellar. Latrines froze over quickly, which meant soldiers often relieved themselves wherever they could. Combine that with no bathing and lice infestations, and you've got a recipe for epidemics. Typhus, in particular, was rampant. Lice carried it from soldier to soldier, and the symptoms, fever, rashes, delirium, spread like wildfire through crowded winter camps. Scurvy was another problem. Without fresh vegetables, soldiers' gums swelled and teeth loosened. Their wounds healed poorly. Imagine trying to gnaw on your hard biscuit while half your teeth rattled around. Not exactly fine dining. And frostbite? Well, frostbite was everywhere. Fingers, toes, noses, ears, frozen and blackened. Amputations were common, though amputation here usually meant a soldier's friend hacking off a dead toe with a knife, since actual surgeons were in short supply. The lucky ones kept their fingers, the unlucky ones lost them, along with the ability to hold a musket, which in Napoleon's army was not exactly an ideal career development. But in spite of all this, some soldiers managed to keep a sense of humor, or at least a kind of resigned sarcasm. Letters home often mentioned the absurdity of the situation. One soldier wrote about cooking a soup so thin the stars could shine through it. Another described sleeping so close to his comrades that they all woke up frozen together in one lump. Comedy, but with frostbite. Now, let's drift over to the subject of horses, because horses were the backbone of Napoleon's army. They pulled wagons, carried officers, and were, unfortunately, also the backup food supply. When horses dropped dead from exhaustion or starvation, soldiers wasted no time carving them up. Some accounts mention men eating raw horse meat straight off the carcass because cooking it took too long and fuel was scarce. Others dried strips of horse flesh in the sun. Yes, winter sun jerky. The soldiers even had a grim nickname for this, cheval à la mode. Very fashionable, very chewy. But horses weren't only eaten. Their hides became makeshift blankets or boots. Bones got boiled. Hooves got burned for whatever trace nutrients they contained. The horse became, in effect, a survival kit on four legs. Once it stopped being a legged survival kit, it transformed into dinner. Alcohol deserves another quiet moment here, because while official rations sometimes included wine or brandy, the supply never matched demand. Soldiers turned to whatever they could find: local spirits, peasant moonshine, even medicinal alcohol. In Russia, vodka became the unofficial lifeline. Soldiers drank it to warm themselves, to numb pain, to forget their misery, and sometimes just because it was the only thing not frozen solid. Of course, this led to drunken accidents, fires, frostbite from passing out in the snow, even quarrels. But when your alternative was total despair, the bottle often won. Now, let's not forget the emotional side. Soldiers were often young, late teens, early 20s, far from home, homesick, and exhausted. Letters home, when they managed to send them, were filled with longing. Many never reached their families, of course, but the act of writing gave soldiers a moment of normalcy. You can imagine them sitting by a tiny campfire, scribbling with numb fingers, trying to tell their mothers that everything was fine, while in reality, they were shivering in a snow pit and chewing frozen horse meat. Friendship, as mentioned earlier, was key. Soldiers leaned on each other, literally and emotionally. They shared stories from home. They gave each other nicknames. They joked about their officers. In some cases, soldiers even adopted stray dogs or cats they found along the march, both for companionship and the faint hope of extra warmth. Though yes, sometimes the animals ended up as emergency rations. War is bleak. Let's gently drift into one last survival trick: improvisation. Soldiers were masters of making something out of nothing. A broken musket might become a crutch. A torn uniform turned into foot wraps. Frozen mud was carved into makeshift bowls. Buttons were stolen off dead comrades to replace missing ones. Even gunpowder had its secondary uses. Mixed with grease, it sometimes became a crude fire starter. And so through all these grim, strange little adaptations, Napoleon's ordinary soldiers dragged themselves from one winter to the next. Not heroes in shining armor, but stubborn, shivering, half-starved men who somehow kept moving forward. So when you think of Napoleon's wars, it's easy to picture the dramatic battles, the cannon smoke, the cavalry charges, the glittering uniforms. But for the vast majority of his soldiers, war wasn't about glory. It was about trying to find something edible in a frozen wasteland. It was about sharing a lice-ridden blanket with 3 snoring comrades. It was about stumbling through snow on bleeding feet, praying you'd see the next sunrise. And with that image, let's slowly move forward, because there's still more misery to explore. Next, we'll glide into how discipline, punishment, and sheer military routine shaped survival in Napoleon's winter camps.
So far, we've trudged along with Napoleon's soldiers through frozen mud, eaten our imaginary horse jerky, and shared a lice-ridden blanket with strangers. Cozy. But here's the thing. For all that misery, the French army didn't run on vibes alone. It ran on discipline. And that discipline didn't just vanish in the snow. In fact, in winter, when morale was slipping and supplies were thin, discipline became even more important, and sometimes even more ridiculous. Let's start with the basics, the daily routine. Even in freezing weather, the army clung to its schedules. Soldiers woke up at dawn, or earlier if the officers were feeling particularly cruel. Imagine dragging yourself up from your snow pit, half frozen, your clothes stiff as boards, only to hear a sergeant yelling for roll call. Yes, they still did roll call because apparently nothing says good morning than standing in icy wind while someone counts noses. After that, if the army was marching, the order came to pack up camp. Which sounds simple until you remember that packing up meant scraping frozen mud off your gear, tying together a tent that probably didn't exist, and trying to stuff half-rotten bread into your knapsack. Then off you went again, another day of walking through slush with your musket slapping against your shoulder. If the army was staying put, routine shifted into chores. And chores in winter were not glamorous. Collecting firewood, if any still existed, digging latrines into frozen ground, repairing shoes with bits of cloth, sharpening weapons, cleaning muskets with numb fingers even though the muskets were more likely to misfire than to actually shoot straight in the snow. But Napoleon's army loved order, so the drills went on. Soldiers practiced marching in formation on ice. They fired volleys into the crisp air, because apparently nothing lifts the spirits like synchronized misery. Now, let's talk punishment. Because soldiers didn't just get to slack off when they were tired or frozen. The Napoleonic army had strict rules, and winter wasn't an excuse to break them. Desertion, of course, was a major crime. If caught, deserters could be executed, lined up and shot as an example, which in sub-zero temperatures almost seems redundant. But Napoleon wanted obedience, not excuses. For smaller offenses, punishments were creative. Extra fatigue duty, like hauling heavy loads of wood or digging latrines into the frozen ground. Sometimes public humiliation, like being forced to stand without a coat in the cold while your comrades marched past. Other times, soldiers were tied up, flogged, or deprived of rations, because nothing says discipline than taking food away from someone who's already starving. And then there were the legendary punishments for falling asleep on guard duty. Picture it. You're exhausted, half frozen, and it's the middle of the night. You're supposed to watch for enemy patrols, but your eyelids weigh 1,000 pounds. You nod off. If caught, the punishment could be severe. Flogging, extra duties, even execution, which, frankly, makes sense in military logic, but also maybe give the poor guy a nap.
Of course, not all officers were monsters. Some turned a blind eye, especially in the worst winters, knowing their men were at the breaking point. Others even shared their own rations or helped gather firewood. But many officers stuck to the book. Discipline first, humanity second. And so the soldiers shuffled on, balancing fear of frostbite with fear of punishment. Let's float into how hierarchy shaped survival. Officers generally had better quarters, better clothing, and better food, which didn't always endear them to their men. While the soldiers were gnawing on frozen biscuits, the officers might enjoy slightly fresher bread or even meat. While soldiers slept in pits, officers sometimes took over peasant houses. You can imagine the resentment bubbling under the surface. But oddly, the system held together. Because Napoleon's men weren't just fighting for pay, they were fighting for pride, for loyalty to their comrades, and sometimes just because leaving wasn't an option. Desertion was risky, and surrender to the enemy wasn't appealing either. So discipline kept them moving forward, even when common sense.
Another tool of discipline was propaganda. Napoleon and his officers constantly reminded soldiers of their glory. They were told they were the bravest, the best, the invincible Grande Armée. And for a while, soldiers believed it. Even shivering in the snow, they clung to the idea that they were part of something world-changing. And in fairness, they kind of were, just not in a way that warmed their feet. Napoleon himself occasionally addressed the troops directly. He'd ride out, deliver a short speech, maybe promise rewards. His presence carried weight. Soldiers admired him, even loved him, though perhaps less so when their toes were dropping off in Russia. Still, the myth of Napoleon, this short, unstoppable genius, kept many soldiers marching. Because when you believe you're part of history, it's easier to ignore the frostbite. Let's shift gently to one more survival tactic enforced by discipline: foraging patrols. Officially, these were organized teams sent out to gather supplies from nearby villages. In practice, they were armed scavenger hunts. Officers made sure patrols were controlled, at least in theory, so the army didn't completely alienate the locals. But in winter, desperation overruled policy. Soldiers raided cellars, took livestock, and stripped houses. Sometimes they paid with worthless paper money. More often, they just took what they wanted. Discipline here was more about limiting chaos than stopping it. One interesting thing about Napoleonic discipline is how it was both brutal and oddly flexible. Soldiers might get flogged one day and rewarded the next. A man could be punished for stealing food, but praised for stealing it successfully when rations ran out. It was a system of contradictions, strict rules, but constant bending of them when survival demanded it. And yet the army held together, somehow. The Grande Armée didn't dissolve in winter, even when logic said it should have. The soldiers kept trudging, kept fighting, kept obeying, not because life was good, but because the combination of fear, loyalty, pride, and sheer inertia was stronger than hunger and cold. Now let's drift to a smaller detail: inspections. Even in winter, officers inspected their men. Uniforms had to be in order, muskets cleaned, boots checked. Imagine lining up in the snow, your coat stiff with frost, while an officer lectures you about polishing your buttons. It was absurd, but it also gave structure. In the chaos of war, routines like that were anchors. Pointless anchors, maybe, but anchors nonetheless. Religious observance played a role too. Chaplains sometimes held services, even in the snow. Soldiers gathered around, shivering, listening to prayers. Religion offered comfort, a reminder of something beyond the misery. And for the officers, it was another tool of discipline. Faith kept men obedient. Punishment could also come in the form of isolation. Soldiers who misbehaved were sometimes denied shelter, forced to sleep outside the group, which in winter was essentially a death sentence if prolonged. So most men did their best to toe the line. Survival often meant staying inside the circle, both literally and socially.
Through it all, routine and punishment gave shape to survival. Soldiers knew what to expect each day, even if what they expected was awful. Wake up, march, drill, forage, freeze, sleep. Over and over. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept them from falling into complete despair. Because the alternative, chaos, disbanding, every man for himself, would have been worse. Without discipline, Napoleon's army would have scattered to the winds at the first snowflake. Instead, it remained an army, barely. An army of frost-bitten, lice-covered, half-starved men, but still an army. And so, discipline was both the enemy and the savior. It punished men harshly, but it also gave them a reason to keep going. It crushed individuality, but preserved the collective. It was misery in the short term, survival in the long term. Let's float gently away from punishments now, because there's another layer to survival we haven't touched yet. Not just the soldiers' bodies or their routines, but their inner lives, their emotions, their hopes, their private coping strategies. That's where we'll drift next.
Now, let's move into faith and superstition lingering afterward. Remember the garlic, the herbs, the amulets. Those didn't go away. Survivors clung to them even more tightly as symbols of what had worked. If your grandmother survived while wearing a dried toad around her neck, you'd probably keep that toad forever, not because it actually saved her, but because you wanted to believe in something. Some villages even developed local miracle objects, a saint statue that hadn't been toppled during the plague, a relic that seemed untouched. Ordinary people made pilgrimages to these items, hoping they carried permanent protection. So hiding strategies became traditions, even when the logic behind them was long disproven. Let's not forget the abandoned farms and fields. In many places, crops went unharvested for years. Whole orchards were left to rot. Sheep wandered freely, multiplying in numbers until they outnumbered humans in some regions. So England suddenly had a wool boom. Fewer people meant more land for sheep, and more sheep meant more wool to sell abroad. So while peasants were hiding and villages were collapsing, the wool trade was quietly gearing up for its golden age. It's one of those ironic contrasts. Ordinary people starving in plague huts, while fluffy herds were basically having the time of their lives in abandoned pastures. Now here's a more personal angle. The return from hiding. Imagine you're a child sent away to a distant relative during the plague. Months later, you're brought home only to find your parents gone, or maybe your house abandoned. Children were shuffled into new homes, raised by uncles, cousins, or sometimes the parish itself. This created a whole generation of orphans, ordinary kids who had once played in the street, now wandering with no clear place to belong. Some grew up into hardened wanderers, joining bands of beggars and thieves. Others were absorbed into wealthier households as servants, basically disappearing into someone else's family history. So, hiding didn't always mean safety. Sometimes it meant coming back to a life that had no place for you anymore. And let's glide toward one last point tonight: memory and storytelling. Ordinary people told and retold plague stories for decades afterward. Grandparents would whisper about how they'd hidden in a barn or bricked themselves in with onions at the window. Children grew up hearing tales of the year when the air was poisoned and the bells never stopped. These stories became folklore, shaping how entire communities understood disease for centuries. Even when the actual science was nonsense, the memory of hiding, of doing something, was passed down as a kind of survival wisdom. So,
The legacy of hiding from the Black Death wasn't just in the empty houses or the wealth redistribution. It was also in the quiet bedtime tales that made children clutch their blankets a little tighter, not unlike what we're doing right now. So, to gather this all together, hiding from the Black Death didn't just mean garlic necklaces or running to the woods. It meant emerging into a world forever altered, empty villages, new families, new wealth for some, despair for others, and a long shadow of superstition, trauma, and half-remembered survival tricks that echoed down the generations. Ordinary people didn't just hide. They rebuilt, they remembered, and they carried their strange little coping methods into the future. That's where we'll close Part 3. Next time, we'll keep drifting, this time into the social shifts that hiding created. Changes in religion, peasant rebellions, and even the quiet rise of the middle class. Because hiding didn't just keep people alive. It quietly set the stage for an entirely new Europe. So, stay cozy, stay calm, and let the bells and whispers of the 14th century fade gently into the background.